Nick Gillespie and to some extent Matt Welch, their version of reason was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Mine is more like sex, drugs, and robots.
I'm Virginia Postrel. I was the editor of Reason magazine in the 1990s, and tonight we're speaking with Katherine Mangu-Ward, Reason magazine's newest editor. In about 10 or 15 minutes, we'll take some questions from those of you who are watching live on Facebook. But let's start out with, so you're the editor of the print magazine, and back in my day, when I became editor, that was the only Reason magazine, and today, of course, Reason has a huge web presence, 2.5 million visitors, and compared to the still holding steady at 50,000 subscribers to the print magazine. What do you see as the role of a print magazine of any kind, and specifically this one, in the digital age?
So as someone who reads virtually nothing on Detrick, I'm actually in kind of a weird position that I'm, editing a magazine every month. I think, for us, increasingly we just look to make the best content that we can make, and then we put it wherever it makes sense. So, the magazine is still a place to house really big, juicy, long form features, and I think people do like to read them in that form. I mean, I know that when I'm reading online, I tend to maybe trail away before I get to the end of the article. I think having the physical magazine serves as sort of I was going to say a nag, but maybe that's not, a sort of visual reminder that you should finish that story because there's probably good stuff at the end. And I think it's a little bit more of a lasting product. I mean, I would like to think when you look through the archives of Reason magazine, you can sort of get a sense of, okay, well, this is what Virginia Postrel was up to in the 90s. This is what Nick Gillespie was up to. This is Matt Welch, and hopefully people will have a sense of the kind of evolution of Reason as my editorship occurs.
And you became editor officially, July 1st?
Like 5 minutes ago, yeah. So my first issue is out, and I was the managing editor before that, so my dirty little paws are all over some Matt Welch issues as well, but the official first issue with my name at the top of the masthead is the October issue, which, yes, it's August, and yes, the October issue just came out because print is a weird place. I like to think that we live in the future in print. Like, the election is over for me, so you should probably be really jealous of me, actually.
And speaking of the future of the print issues, you have some changes coming up, starting with the January issue?
Yes, we're burning the printing presses to the ground and starting over. No, we're redesigning the issue, the magazine. So for now, the changes will just be the print magazine, and it will be sometime in early 2017 that you'll be seeing the new issue come out. A couple of reasons for that. One, it's been a long time since we redesigned. The last redesign was in 2001, and while I'm sure that it was cutting edge in 2001, that's a good long time ago now. We also have a new art director, Joanna Andresen, who is super talented. She's based in Brooklyn, and she's eager to bring her stamp to the magazine. We're doing the redesign in-house, which is something the last redesign we shopped out. It's easier to do that now. I mean, the tools that are available are better, and also it's just something that Joanna has experience in. She was the founding graphic designer for probably the only Swedish libertarian magazine, which is called Neo. So this is something that she's done before. Right now, we're still doing a little bit too much of publishing 6-week-old news on Detrick and shoving it in people's mailboxes, and I think that doesn't really make sense anymore when so many of our print readers also read online.
So in addition to a new look, what can readers look forward to with the debut of
the most important thing they can look forward to is a return of Virginia Postrel to our pages as a columnist, which is actually part of like a decade-long scheme by me to basically I've like Sheryl Sandberg'd Virginia for years. Like I keep calling her and being like, "Will you be my mentor?" And she's like, "Who are you again?"
You never asked me to be
No, and I would
mentor.
never use those words because that's horrible. But,
yeah, right. Anyway, we believe that reason editors should be raised by wolves without mentors.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's an accurate description of what happened with me. If you replace wolves with Nick Gillespie, that's right. So a column by you. We're going to have Deidre McCloskey in our pages as well. We're going to have a sort of a lifestyle advice type column, which will be shared by Lenore Skenazy, who's our free-range mom, and also Jerry Tuccilli, whose inaugural column, I think, is going to be about the importance of teaching your children to shoot rattlesnakes. So
it's going to be kid-oriented.
It won't always be kid-oriented, but those are sort of two writers that we're going to bring in. And we're going to kind of move to more column-length stuff in the front, stuff that has a little bit more staying power, also more visual. So for those of you who go to the back of the magazine and look for the artifact, which is that little object with the blurb, we're going to be doing more of that in the front of the book. We're also instituting a centerfold. So if anyone has, Playboy stopped publishing nudes, so we're going to step up and do our part with that tradition. They will not actually be nude, just for the record. But we are going to feature kind of an interview and a big photo of somebody in our universe who we want.
Will it fold out?
It will not fold out, but it will be a
centerfold. It's just a two-page spread with staples.
That's kind of a technicality that I hope the reading audience will forgive.
So talking about the lifestyle column gives me a little segue to what I think of as the Brian Lamb portion of our interview, because Brian Lamb, when he does book notes, he'll be asking you about what you said on page 259, and then he says, "Where'd you grow up?"
Are you going to later ask me to define very basic words? Like that's his other shtick. Okay, that's good. I grew up inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., so I am essentially a D.C. lifer. And my parents were good government liberals, and
And what they do for a living?
My mom works in public health, and my dad was an architect. And I read Ayn Rand when I was 15, and that was probably the beginning of the end.
The gateway drug. And are you married, single?
I am. My husband and I live in DuPont Circle downtown, about 3 blocks from the Reason office, because I'm incredibly lazy, and we have 2 kids.
And how old are they?
They are 5 and 2.
Girls, boys?
The eldest is a girl and the youngest is a boy.
And I don't see how you do that, because I think being editor of Reason requires no children.
It's an overlapping skill set to manage freelance writers and 5-year-olds, actually.
And where'd you go to school?
So I went to T.C. Williams High School in Alexandria, which is, for anyone who ever saw the movie Remember the Titans, that is the school that produced me, for better or for worse. And then Yale as an undergrad, where I majored in political science and philosophy, and edited the Yale Free Press, which is not the real paper at Yale.
That would be the Yale Daily. And why politics and philosophy?
So, like I say, I read Ayn Rand when I was 15, but I just kind of was like, I'm an objectivist, I'm better than everyone, and I think I was probably super horrible to be around that summer, but worked my way through all of Ayn Rand's writings. I went to a sort of perfectly decent school, but I'd never been exposed at all to ethics or really philosophy of any kind or economics. So if you can imagine that, like, basically, I was like, this lady is on to some amazing stuff, you guys. Like, she has these theories about how the world works. And I kind of made it all the way through high school, and then I got to college, and actually, it's quite clever at Yale. There's a front group that's called the Objectivist Study Group at Yale, but it's all ex-objectivists. And they bring you in, and then they say, oh no, what you really probably are is a libertarian who's interested in philosophy. Have you read? And then they give you a big stack of books of other thinkers. And as was true in my case, you're like, oh my God, they're right. I actually am a libertarian who's interested in philosophy and not, strictly speaking, an objectivist, although I still feel fondly toward my Ayn Rand groupie days. So
what other writers have influenced you, either back then or more recently?
So back then I kind of worked my way through the canon, libertarian canon, aided and abetted by the college libertarian industrial complex, right? So the Institute for Humane Studies and the Collegiate Network and a whole bunch of other groups. When they notice somebody out there who might agree with them, they kind of send you off to conferences, and it's all very nice. These days, I would actually say the books that most influence me are science fiction. Ramez Nam, who is a recommendation from Reason's science correspondent Ron Bailey, who writes sort of incredibly evocative books. One of the best ones is it's called Nexus, and in it there's this description of how prohibition will fail when we're trying to prohibit mind-altering computer code, right? And it's like, that's not something that's like, okay, we're gonna need to cover that issue in Reason today, but I'd like to think we're gonna need to cover that issue in Reason before my tenure as editor is over. So that's kind of where I'm looking to find new ideas or something that's cutting edge.
So being an editor and being a writer are two different things. And one of the things that used to amuse me when I was editor was that people thought that this 60-hour week that I was working was devoted to writing one editorial a month. So there are ideas that you like to write about as a writer, and there are ideas you like to write about, like to have written about by other people, and I'd like to talk about both of those. You mentioned science fiction. You obviously are very interested in technology and the future, and I believe in this new redesign you're going to do a column too, right?
Yeah.
It's
not. I mean, there will be an editor's column. Each of the columns have a sort of topic heading, and mine might be something like futurism or the future or something.
Yeah. And so, what draws you to those issues?
So I think a lot of libertarians are very pessimistic, like the world is collapsing around our ears and like authoritarianism is upon us. But there's this sort of countervailing thread of almost like manic optimism that's like, we're gonna have a colony on Mars in 5 minutes. And I'm just like totally on that side of the equation. Like I just think like, I just look around me and see good news everywhere. And the easiest way to convey that sense of optimism is to say, here's the technology that's coming in a year or 2 years or 10 years, but also just a friendly reminder that you have basically impossible technologies and amenities in your life already. And if you are tempted by a declinist narrative, you should fight it because the reality is far from that.
And aside from your own work, things that you might write, what do you want to see more of in the magazine, either topics or types of articles?
So one thing that I've kind of, stumbled into as managing editor and hope to do more of as editor-in-chief is to look a little bit outside the borders of the United States. Reason historically has had international coverage, but it's been kind of spotty and it's come and gone over the years. We have a great piece a couple issues ago about growing coffee in Haiti and how the coffee trees in Haiti are very poorly tended because of the incentives that are created by the kind of foreign aid machine. It's not really a lesson that's like applicable to the United States. It's just a thing I thought was cool, and it's a former Reason intern who wrote it. We also have Jim Epstein, one of our video producers, went to Brazil recently and covered this amazing libertarian-driven uprising that unseated a head of state there. And I think that's something that Reason should obviously be covering, and it's sort of flown below the radar in a lot of ways. These are people who are holding up signs like that have Mises' face on them. They're like shouting like more privatization in the streets, like million people shouting for privatization in the streets, which I don't know about you guys, but like when I wake up in the middle of the night, like that's what I'm dreaming about. What? So maybe Brazil.
So the Haiti article is actually in the new issue.
Yeah.
This shows how editors get
I don't know
about
what's
it.
in
You have no
issue.
idea
I
what
never
month
have
it
idea.
is, especially it's even more extreme if you live in Southern California where you can't have weather. Anyway, so my father called me this morning. Hello. And my father almost never calls me. Usually I call him. And I'm like, I'm on deadline. What is it? And he had gotten the new issue of Reason.
That's also how all my phone calls start, by the way. I'm on deadline.
And he had read your lead editorial, Trump versus Clinton versus Everything Good, where you quote The Future and Its Enemies, my book. That's why Daddy was interested. He doesn't care about your argument. He only cares about his little princess. And a lot of this is about the what's sometimes called the permissionless economy, asking, you start Uber and you don't ask permission, you try to build. And I wanted you to talk about, I'm sort of skeptical. I know that this works sometime, but part of the reason I wrote The Future and Its Enemies was that I felt like there are genuine threats. There are enemies. Things can be closed down. But you're pretty optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, it's potentially a character flaw. I'm open to that interpretation. I think, yes, the future has enemies. And I think Uber is actually a great example, and I get into it, I sort of hint at it in my EndNote, but they're this incredible model of permissionless innovation. They're also a model of how quickly you go from being an upstart to a rent seeker, right? I mean, Uber is, in New York in particular, has already given in to a bunch of pressure from the state and from the city of New York. They've acted to push through rules and regulations and guidelines that will probably hedge out their competitors. So the evolution can be you can be the hero and the villain of the same story. And I think Elon Musk, who's also mentioned there, it can be a controversial figure among libertarians for the same reasons. He's, has many professed free market principles. The dude started a rocket company because screw NASA. And at the same time, NASA's now a customer. And there are people who have mixed feelings about that. I do not have mixed feelings about that, by the way, and think he's kind of a hero. But I guess I just think it's the relative rates of growth and change that are the main thing. I just think, at least in my memory, the spectacular growth of the future is not sufficiently retarded by its enemies to make me alarmed to the extent that I think you're the sort of conclusion of your book.
Now, one argument is that it channels the nature of regulations. It channels innovation in certain ways. So we have a tremendous amount of regulation in the world. I mean, a tremendous amount of innovation in the world of bits, because it's lightly regulated.
Yep.
We have much less innovation, at least visible innovation, in the world of atoms, because there are many more veto players. It's more explicitly regulated, and there are just also many more ways to stop things. And whether you're talking about material science, or whether you're talking about building houses, or whatever, or Uber. And one of the interesting things about these gig economy businesses, is that they use the world of bits, but they're really in the world of atoms. So I wonder if there is, I don't know, there's hope there. There is, or is it that we just kind of have to take what we can get?
I mean, I think what we can get is pretty good still. So that's kind of my bottom line. I will say I saw a chart the other day that was the consumer price index broken out by sector. Right. And the price of TVs, relatively speaking, is, a fraction of what it once was, and the price of education and healthcare are, astronomically higher than they once were. And I think, I always, clearly my greatest vice is confirmation bias, right? When I see stuff that agrees, everybody's is, I'm like maybe over aware of that buzz, right? So I like looked at this chart and I was like, can I come up with a non-libertarian interpretation of this chart? Like, can I tell a story about why these sectors went in opposite directions that doesn't reinforce my pre-existing libertarian beliefs? And then I was like, nope, I can't. Like, the sectors where government meddles most aggressively are the sectors that haven't seen fantastical, amazing growth.
But let's talk about something that did see fantastical, amazing growth, and then boom. Plastic bags. Yeah. You wrote a great cover story about plastic bags. And for those who foolishly did not read it, or maybe have not remembered it, could you give us a little capsule summary of what you're writing about?
So it was basically a defense of the beleaguered plastic bag, and the idea was actually sparked by
these are grocery bags.
Grocery bags, right? So the little filmy grocery bags that you get that that used to be ubiquitous, and now everybody totes around the reusable bags, and it's all very wholesome and socially signaling.
Yes.
Virginia.
I got this at a trade show actually, but it's for my groceries.
So the inspiration for the article was actually some work by Julian Morris at the Reason Foundation, who had kind of gathered together a bunch of studies, and he had published a very super respectable white paper on this question. And I was like, we should probably sensationalize this and put it on the cover of Reason magazine. So the argument is essentially that it's like the plastic bag is a miracle of materials science. It uses virtually nothing. It uses like 5 molecules to carry 2 gallons of milk. And, it's, if you look at the math about what actually consumes resources and in what ways, it's not at all clear that these reusable bags that everyone uses are on net better on any of the tokens that people argue. So water pollution, or like pollution of our rivers and oceans, water use, resource use, global warming. So the piece just ticks through all of the arguments for why you should use this like super trendy bag that says this is not a plastic bag on it. And I hope obliterates them all. The piece of the article that I wanted to be stronger that didn't work out in the end was I really wanted there to be a study that conclusively showed that plastic bags were protecting all of us from E. coli, and that we were all going to die of horrible intestinal ailments if we kept using these reusable bags. And there is some evidence for that claim, but it is not as robust.
It's like the argument that if we have compact fluorescent bulbs, we're all going to die of mercury poisoning, which is nonsense. Yeah. And if we were on the other side, we would see it as nonsense. But because we don't like light bulb bans, a lot of people
see previous comments about confirmation bias.
Exactly. So that's the same kind of thing. One of the interesting things about your career, as distinct from mine or Nick's or Matt's, is that, and you actually alluded to this earlier, is that you came up through a coherent career path designed to produce the editor of Reason magazine, essentially.
It sounds really sinister.
You went, first of all, we have something in common, very unusual as Reason editors, which is that we both went to Ivy League schools. But you went to the one that produces Think magazine editors, or one of the two, whereas I went to the one that produces Jeff Bezos.
Now you're just bragging.
But a bunch of nerds, and a bunch of horrible. Also, Elliot Spitzer. Okay, so there was that. But then you were an intern at Reason. You worked at the Weekly Standard. You worked for John Tierney, whereas Nick interviewed Alf over the telephone for a teen magazine, and I was a business journalist, and Matt started a paper in Czechoslovakia. And we had these weird, none of that infrastructure really existed when we were coming up. How, if at all, does that change what sort of editor you are, and what does it say about the environment?
So I don't know if you guys have seen that, the first 7 jobs hashtag that's been going around, right? So this is just people on Twitter, on Facebook, sharing what their first 7 jobs were. And I think it's fantastic. It's such a great, I don't know actually what the origin of it is, but I would like to think that it was originated by people who are trying to combat minimum wage laws, because it's a reminder that everybody had these weird, dumb jobs that
I was
paid
fired
badly.
when the minimum wage went from $2.30 to $2.65.
So we now know the exact value of your labor.
I was a terrible employee and the marginal worker, but
right. But if I were designing a campaign to oppose minimum wage laws, this is what I would do. I would get everyone in America to remind themselves of their first 7 jobs. But my entry would be horrible, because my first 7 jobs, this is my 7th job. I mean, you're right. I came up through, in a world where it was very easy for me to get internships and have school experiences and get subsidized by a variety of benevolent donors to do all the stuff that, I would like to think will make me a good Reason editor. And fun fact, actually, when I was a Reason intern in the summer of 2000 in Washington, D.C., before we had a D.C. office, most of my summer was spent transcribing the world's longest interview with this obscure governor from New Mexico about how he was like running marathons or something. And I was like, who is this guy? But actually by the end of the summer, I was like, this guy's going somewhere. And of course it's Gary Johnson, right? And there's a sort of weird, like circular nature, I think, to like, you know, here I am still staring down the barrel of Gary Johnson, like puff pieces, you know, so many years later. But yeah, I mean, I actually think, you know, in a lot of ways, I probably suffer from not having come up through various weird paths because I barely exist outside this universe of like, you know, think magazines, but I also love it, and I also like, I think I'm pretty knowledgeable about the field. Right. You know, that's the flip side of having no other jobs is I've spent a lot of time reading the archives of all of these magazines, for instance.
So what other magazines do you admire, you know, not necessarily for their political philosophy, but for their journalism?
Yeah, so I was actually, I was talking with somebody about this earlier. I was reading the memo outlining what Reason Enterprises would be like, which was written in what year?
So 1969.
Right, so 1969, you know, Reason is barely in existence.
And Katherine is not in existence.
Katherine is so long from being in existence at that point. And it's, you know, it says, well, so the goal is, you know, there's a bunch of goals, and then the kind of final goal is to produce high quality magazine journalism similar to Harper's and the New Yorker, I think were the examples. And like, I think it's like 50 years later and we're still working on that. But you know, I read The Atlantic, I love The Atlantic. You know, read the New Yorker, but I actually, like I said, I don't read print magazines that much. I consume them online. I consume them, you know, on a tablet.
I could ask, which websites do you like? Which publications?
Yeah, and I think, you know, in some ways the list really hasn't changed that much from what you might have said decades ago. But I also think that Reason's video division, for instance, was very early in being super high quality, and that's a place where I think we do kind of set a gold standard. I mean, there's really nobody that's competing directly up against us to do the kind of things that we do that I think are as good as we are. So there are places where I would say we're already at the top of the heap, and places where we still have some work to do, including the print magazine.
Yeah. So there was an interview with you, since you're the new editor, a number of people have interviewed you, and there was an interview with you. I actually don't remember if it was because of your new job or your old job, but that was advice for young, aspiring intern journalist types in DC. And one of the things you talked about in that was what you called DC's happy hour culture. What is DC's happy hour culture?
So this is the thing that conspiracy theorists imagine, right? Like sometimes we get these people who will say like, oh, you just wrote that article because you want to be invited to those DC cocktail parties. And so you have to be like nice and palatable and not rock the boat. And the answer is like, I do want to be invited to those DC cocktail parties. I am invited to those DC cocktail parties. And if anything, I'm invited due to my non-palatability, right? Like there's a sort of actually...
Look at this crazy woman.
Let's bring the crazy in. But I will say actually, just as a side note, like being a libertarian woman is like the best path of tokenism that you can imagine. And like, I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, but I think I hit the sweet spot of it. It was like the world was ready for a few more of me, but the supply was very limited. So it was like, let's invite Katherine to all the things. And now I think it's like, libertarian ladies, a dime a dozen.
It wasn't that interesting back in the 90s either. It was kind of... if you didn't write about women's issues, they weren't interested in you.
But I think my advice to younger journalists was like, go to happy hours, make friends, if that's your strength. But a lot of writers are introverts and a bit socially inept. So also know thyself.
So this is a bad year, I think, for political, for dynamism, as I would put it. We have the two major candidates running very strongly against trade, against immigration, against change in many ways, against the bottom-up change, and not only running against it, but particularly in the Republican Party, sort of purging it from their coalition. The Democrats is a little more confusing. It's never been a big part of their coalition, but they haven't actually purged the ones who are there. Why shouldn't I be super pessimistic about this? Where do we go from here?
I feel like this is actually secretly a therapy session, and you're just trying to get me to cheer you up. Is that what's really happening?
No, I sit around thinking about 500,000-year periods and
so
cheer myself up.
You're like above all this, but
it's not the Inquisition.
Yeah. Right. So this election cycle is horrific, and in fact, like about once a week, I come in and I open up Twitter and I'm like, this is it. I've lost my capacity to be shocked by the horror that is 2016. And then like my Twitter feed scrolls a little bit and I'm like, you guys, did you see this? And it's like, once again, I am full of rage and despair. Yes, it's like the two major party conventions were this sort of hysterical display of status quo thinking.
Trump versus Clinton versus
everything good. Yeah. And, I do think that what now seems to be the sort of universal opposition to the idea that the movement of people and goods across borders is a force for good is going to have long-term negative consequences. Like this story cannot end well. And, whether you sort of pinpoint the specific people moving across our borders in which direction and the specific goods in which direction, the total lack of that insight from our political discourse is absolutely the thing that scares me the most about 2016.
Right. Now, it's interesting, you use the term status quo, and there are many terms I might use to describe Donald Trump, but that is not one of them. And in fact, there's a certain type of libertarian who kind of likes the whole Trump phenomenon because they want to burn everything down. It's not that they necessarily like Donald Trump, but they just like his destructive power. Do you see that? Do you see that element out there, or even on the staff?
I do see it out in the world. I don't really see it on Reason's staff. I am sympathetic to, I think, the impulse behind some of that Trump support, which is nothing that we're doing is even remotely working. Let's try something else. And I think for some people, Trump is the manifestation of that. I think people who are looking for anti-war sentiment in Trump, which is a certain subset of libertarians, are missing the forest for the trees. Like, he may have said some words sometimes that sounded a little bit like something that might have been opposition to a war at one point, but I feel no reason to be confident that would
He's not against fighting or starting wars. He's merely against losing them.
Right. He's going to be the best at wars.
He's going to be the best at wars.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I guess I would be wary of looking for sort of any version of a libertarian bright note on, again, though, from either party.
Right. So one of the big tensions within the libertarian movement is between what I think of as Bob Poole style or even Milton Friedman style libertarian incrementalism, where you have a person who's like a diehard libertarian, but they really get down in the weeds and they think about like, how can we move from A to B, as opposed to, be mad that we're not at Z. So there's that, and then there's the burn it all down. We want to have floating cities. Anarchism is the way to go. That's sort of libertarian utopianism, you might call it. Where do you stand on that spectrum, and how do you see those tensions playing out in the magazine?
So first of all, that was like the most stacked question I've ever heard.
I know. You can tell which side I come down.
On one side, we have Milton Friedman and Reason's founder. On the other side, we have people who just want the world to burn, which, fair enough. You get to ask the question.
No, that was the Trump people want the world to burn. No, the anarchists
they want the world to burn so that a libertarian utopia can spring up from the ashes.
They don't talk necessarily about how to get there. Right. They're not necessarily destructive. It's a utopian, we want Milton Friedman, what a wuss.
Yeah.
You know, what a wet. You know.
So, I mean, I am sympathetic to both sides, and I think that it sounds like a wussy answer, but I actually, I'm sporting my Reason Orange today, which wasn't fully on purpose, but probably was subconscious messaging here. I mean, my libertarianism is Reason libertarianism, which is not a coherent body, and so I kind of think, well, let's make a magazine that always has a floating city in it and also always has like more hot lanes.
Yeah, I think
Right, like-
Bob probably likes the floating city.
Bob
I
also-
haven't
Bob-
talked to him about it, but
Bob may be on a floating city right now for all we know. Like, has anybody seen him in a while? But, you know, I think there's no point in the incrementalism unless you're going somewhere. And it's, you know, I think a big disease of American politics is that people don't have somewhere, they just want to win. They want their team to win. They want red versus blue. And I think, you know, the animating principle of a lot of incrementalism can and should be, you know, let's privatize the roads. But you don't have to say that every time at the end of your argument, right? Like, it's, to me, it's a rhetorical stance to just say, if you and I can agree on legalizing pot, I don't need to say, but also heroin and vending machines for children at the end of the conversation. Like, you don't need to do that every time. And not doing that doesn't mean you should be drummed out of the league.
So the rap on libertarians in general and Reason in particular out there in glib Twitter world or whatever is that just people who all they care about is drugs. Is that all you care about?
I was going to say, what's the question? Like, yes, that's all we care about. I mean, you know, I would say drugs is part of what we do at Reason. Both is literally what we do at Reason sometimes, and also it's a thing we advocate for legalizing. And you know, it's probably too early to say, but you know, sort of Nick Gillespie and to some extent Matt Welch, their version of Reason was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Mine is more like sex, drugs, and robots, but it's still drugs. I think that's like, it's just an important
Maybe
thing.
a different kind of drugs too.
Probably
in terms
more
of
like I want,
biohacking,
you know,
kind of.
like, yeah, a pill that I can, like, you know, turn my eyeballs into computers is more my jam, but like everybody can do their own thing. I think it's a place where we're actually winning. And that's a sort of super refreshing place to
I remember
be.
Jacob Solom wrote something about like, whoa, what world have I woken up in? I'm on the winning side.
You know, the libertarian moment has been trotted out a lot by Reason and by others, and it certainly doesn't feel like a libertarian moment when you're looking at, you know, Donald Trump's convention speech. But, you know, Scott Shackford, who works here in the LA office as an associate editor, was saying, you know, it's weird. I actually don't get a lot of traffic when I write posts about incremental gains in, you know, getting drug legalization initiatives on the ballot. You know, people just don't really click on these. And it's because that's old news. Like, it's super boring that Michigan, like, it's probably not going to legalize weed this cycle because they're going to do it next cycle for bureaucratic reasons. That's great. That's awesome. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be constantly reminding people, remember when you treated us like a bunch of crazy idiots because we thought this was a good idea? Welcome to the party.
All right, so we have a question from Joshua Burns. What are your goals for the site/magazine? Now, we should clarify, you are only in charge of the print magazine, although you write for the site as well. Do you intend to grow the readership/membership, and if so, by how much?
All the people in the whole world are going to be reading Reason by the time I'm done. No, so I mean, it actually is an interesting question because in general, print magazine subscriptions are not a growing category, and they haven't been a growing category for decades. But the vast majority of people who read the stuff that we put in the magazine read it online already. And so that audience is always part of my audience. As I'm putting together stuff for the magazine, I'm thinking also, how will this play online? How will this headline work online? You know, how can we visually present it online? And that audience is growing hugely. So our goal is absolutely to keep growing that audience. Right now, our biggest growth area is video, and that's true across our sector. It's true across our industry. So we will give the people video.
Does Reason do active subscription marketing these days, like direct mail and the kind of stuff we just spend $1 gazillion on in the 90s? Or is it basically maintaining and then subscriptions coming in through the website?
We do a lot less of that than we used to do in the 90s. And again, it's because we have, you want to sell stuff people want to buy.
Yeah.
And we have a whole bunch of other stuff to sell, so we
Well,
think
it's a huge money sink too.
we think how do we get more eyeballs on our content per dollar that we spend? And the answer is mostly online. I think one piece of that is that you really do get a different kind of person, right? If you subscribe to Reason Magazine, you're the choir to some extent. That's not universally true, but like mostly if you're going to say I want 11 issues of Reason Magazine every year. You are already sold on some fundamental point about libertarianism, or it's a hate read, but frankly, people mostly don't subscribe for hate reads. Online, it's a really different picture. Half of our visitors come from social, half of our visitors are reading on mobile. So these are people who might, there's this sort of eternal hope that we might be catching someone for the first time, like having that same experience that I had when I was 15 and I read a copy of The Fountainhead, only it's like Scott Shackford on drug legalization. And they're like, wait a minute, it all makes sense now. So,
but you do get the Reason commenters, which I'm notorious for criticizing.
So our commenters, a catchphrase among our commenters when they don't like something is they say, this never would have happened when Virginia was editor. And some of these commenters we're pretty sure were not born when Virginia was editor. She's this kind of like benevolent figure that hovers.
Well, I don't know if the commenters think I'm very benevolent.
But the flip side of it is also Virginia has been known to talk a little smack about our commenters in various fora. And so I would say they both love and fear you. And I can
how about you?
I can only hope for the same.
Forget
for
about
myself.
me. Let's talk about you.
I mean, I am not, I don't like mix it up in the comments section, but I have a weird appreciation for what happens there. I think it is like a little community. And we have a baby that was born because somebody met their partner in our comment section, and that baby's name is Reason Sophia. No. So,
okay.
I'm sure where you guys work is cool too, but...
So let's take one more question. This week, Gary Johnson came out for a carbon tax, forced vaccination, and a smoking ban in private restaurants. How does a libertarian support this guy? Remember when I was talking about the anarchists?
Yeah. So probably the other most infamous cover story that I wrote for Reason was the story that I wrote in 2012 about why I don't vote. So I don't vote. And one reason that I don't vote is because it only encourages the bastards, as they say. Gary Johnson included. I think he's fantastic. I think it's great that he's doing as well as he is doing, but there are plenty of reasonable objections to his positions. I think there are an awful lot more objections to basically everyone else's positions out there. But yeah, he's not like libertarian Jesus Christ come down to save us from our sins.
So someone wants to know, will Reason ever get another Radley Balko? Is there another Radley Balko? He seems like a unique treasure. And how about a Second Amendment column?
Oh, those are good questions. So Reason still has Radley Balko, at least in part.
The original.
We have the original, the golden oldie Radley Balko. Of course, we celebrate that he has gone on to become a blogger for the Washington Post. But you will find him, for instance, in our Who is Worse, Trump or Hillary feature in the last issue. But we really do continue to do the work that he made his name doing at Reason. It's shared among a bunch of staffers, but in some horrible way, it's not hard to do what he does because there are so many stories to tell. I mean, Radley has a real talent for finding incredible cases and really doing justice to telling the stories of people who have been wrongly incarcerated, who have been who have overly harsh sentences, who are just sort of generally victims of an over-aggressive law enforcement bureaucracy. But, there's no shortage of those stories, and we tell them every single day. And that's actually super depressing. Sorry, you guys.
And somebody wants to ask, what advice do you have for aspiring journalists?
My number one piece of advice is don't go to journalism school. You can learn everything you need to know, in an internship. You can learn it on the job. You should probably apply for an internship at Reason Magazine, where we actually pay. So that's a unique and special thing, thanks to the Burton C. Gray Memorial Internship Fund. And the other piece of advice I have, which is advice I frequently give to young journalists, is if you're making ramen noodles, you should put an egg in there because it makes them more delicious and nutritious.
I'm going to read this question, but then I'm going to change it. So other than, because it's a perfectly good question, but I want to, other than marijuana legalization and LGBT rights, what other areas of human freedom, economic or otherwise, are you optimistic about in the near future? So that's a good question, and you feel free to answer that question. But I would actually like to ask, just take the economic point of view.
Okay.
Are there areas of economic freedom where you're optimistic?
Yes.
Or does everything have to focus on these other issues?
So I am going to shamelessly plagiarize the insights of Mark Andreessen, who is the probably the most prolific tweeter in my Twitter feed, and P-Marka, all over the place.
Does a lot late at night, which I love.
Yeah, so definitely follow that guy. He's of course a super famous venture capitalist and internet entrepreneur, and he says, how could you not be optimistic about a world where every single person, maybe 2 billion additional people, have access to essentially the means of production in the form of a smartphone or an internet connection? I am not super optimistic about economic growth in the United States narrowly in the very near future. I am wildly, insanely optimistic about economic growth in many very, very poor countries, because in the last couple of decades, 1 billion people went from basically starving to not starving. And when you stop starving to death, you start being able to do incredible stuff. And also the
But if we listen to Donald Trump, they would go back to starving.
Right, because we don't want them to make goods and
whatever.
sell them to us, God forbid. I think a little bit more education and a little bit less starving is it sounds sort of like overly simplistic, but it's probably the most powerful force for economic growth that you could imagine, to say, here's a way to access all of the information that humans have, and here's maybe 5 minutes of leisure time, and how can that not be a huge boom? How can that not be an incredible area of growth? I think there's political uncertainty and political conditions that keep people down, and those will continue to exist, but I think there's a countervailing force.
Are there any Senate, House, or gubernatorial races this fall that Reason will be paying particular attention to? Yeah, forget the president.
I am not the best person to answer that question, but I think
that would be Matt.
Matt would be an excellent person as our editor-at-large, which I love that title because it sounds like he's on the lam. From me, maybe? From I don't know what. But yes, our editor-at-large, who is essentially right now acting as a politics reporter and is mostly covering the presidential election, but other levels. I think that people pay totally insufficient attention to down-ticket races, and that is an irrational behavior of which they should be ashamed, and also one in which I participate.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks
to our questioners online.